moving into our new home felt like a fresh start. The house was everything we'd dreamed of. Spacious, with a cozy backyard, and just enough character to make it unique. On our first night, we decided to explore every nook and cranny. That's when we found the door in the basement. It was an old, heavy wooden door at the end of a dimly lit corridor, and it stood out because it didn't match the rest of the basement. Every other door in the house had shiny brass knobs and fresh coats of paint, but this one was scuffed, with a rusted iron handle. When we tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. "I'm sure it's just a storage closet," my wife said. But there was something about it that unsettled me. I asked the realtor about it the next day. She waved it off, saying she hadn't noticed it, and that the previous owners hadn't mentioned anything unusual. Curiosity got the better of me, so I spent the next week trying every key I could find. Keys from the junk drawer, keys from the garage, even one from an old lockbox. Nothing worked. A few days later, we started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, like a rustle or a soft tapping. We thought it was the pipes, or maybe mice. But the sounds grew louder and more deliberate. One night, we heard scratching, slow, deliberate strokes, as if someone on the other side of the door was clawing to get out. "I'm calling a locksmith," I said, but my wife wasn't convinced. "It's an old house," she reasoned. "It's probably just settling." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, it happened. It was late, and we were both in bed when we heard a loud creak, followed by a sharp bang. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was open. The air that seeped out was cold, much colder than the rest of the basement. Shining my flashlight inside, I saw what looked like a small, empty room. But as I stepped closer, the beam of light fell on the walls, and my stomach dropped. Photographs. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of the room. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, pictures of families, children playing, couples smiling. But then I saw a photo of us. It was from a camping trip we'd taken years ago, before we'd even thought about moving into this house. The more I looked, the more I realized every photo in that room was of us. Moments from our lives, some I didn't even remember. And they were all taken long before we'd moved in. My wife gasped, clutching my arm. How is this possible?" I didn't have an answer. My legs felt weak, and a chill crept over me that had nothing to do with the cold air. That night, we packed a few essentials and left. We never stayed in that house again. I don't know who or what had been watching us. But one thing was clear. That locked room wasn't meant to be opened, and whatever secrets it held were things we were never supposed to uncover. The welcoming gift. When I first saw the little countryside home, I thought it was the perfect place to start over with my son, Ethan. It was quaint, tucked away from the chaos of the city, with a wraparound porch and a garden that seemed to bloom even in the chill of autumn. We moved in on a crisp Friday morning, and by nightfall the house already felt like home. As I locked up for the night, I noticed something sitting on the porch. A box, wrapped in glossy red paper with a neat white bow. There was no note, no delivery slip, nothing to suggest who had left it. Curious but cautious, I brought it inside. Ethan, being 6 years old and endlessly curious, bounced up and down as I untied the bow. Inside was a porcelain doll, delicate and old-fashioned, with a face painted so intricately it seemed almost lifelike. She wore a lacy blue dress, her glass eyes staring straight ahead. "She's pretty," Ethan said, reaching for her. "I don't know, Bud," I said hesitantly. "We don't know where it came from." But Ethan had already cradled the doll in his arms. He named her Clara and insisted she needed to sit on the shelf in his room. I figured it was harmless enough. That night, I was startled awake by the sound of Ethan whispering. I tiptoed to his room, cracking the door just enough to peek in. He was sitting up in bed, Clara propped up beside him, her glass eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Who are you talking to, honey?" I asked. "Clara," he said simply. "She's telling me stories." "Stories?" "About the people who used to live here," he said. "She says they didn't like the house very much." Chills crawled up my spine, but I brushed it off as a child's overactive imagination. "Okay. Time to sleep, Ethan. Clara can tell you more tomorrow." The next day I found Clara sitting on the kitchen table. I was sure Ethan had left her on the shelf. When I asked him, he shrugged. "She wanted to watch you make breakfast." By the third day, I was sure something was wrong. I found the doll on the staircase, on the living room couch, even in my bedroom. Each time, Ethan swore he hadn't moved her. And then came the stories. Ethan began recounting details about the house's previous occupants, things he couldn't possibly know. A family had lived here before us, he said, but Clara told him they left because bad things happened. "What bad things, Ethan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They got hurt," he said, his little face serious. "All of them." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside set me on edge. At around 3 a.m., I heard Ethan scream. I bolted to his room, finding him curled in a corner pointing at Clara. The doll was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting upright in the middle of the floor, her head tilted slightly toward Ethan. "She's mad!" he cried. "She doesn't like it when we don't listen to her stories." I grabbed the doll, my hands trembling. Her painted face seemed to smirk under the dim light. Without thinking, I ran outside and threw her into the garden shed, locking the door behind me. The house fell eerily silent after that. Ethan slept soundly for the first time in days. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I found the shed door wide open. Clara was sitting on the porch, her glass eyes glinting in the morning sun, as if she was waiting for us to let her back in. We didn't stay another night. The Unwanted Guest. When my wife and I moved into our new home, it felt like the start of a beautiful chapter. The house wasn't large, but it had character. Creaky wooden floors, a cozy fireplace, and a winding staircase that led to 3 small bedrooms upstairs. We spent the day unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and dreaming of the life we'd build here. It was late evening when the first odd thing happened. I was in the living room, carefully stacking books onto a shelf, when I heard soft, deliberate footsteps above me. The steady creak of floorboards was unmistakable. "Hey, hon," I called out. "Did you find the towels yet?" No response. I sighed, figuring she was too preoccupied to hear me. As I climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The hallway was empty, and the bedroom doors were open, revealing piles of half-unpacked boxes. "Sweetheart?" I called again, this time louder. "I'm outside," came her muffled reply from the front yard. My chest tightened. Who, or what, had been walking upstairs? I stood frozen for a moment, listening, but the house was eerily quiet. Brushing it off as my imagination, I returned to unpacking. That night, we both felt uneasy. The house seemed colder than it should have been, despite the roaring fireplace, and shadows danced strangely across the walls. But we chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed. The next morning, things got stranger. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed the dining chairs had been moved into a perfect circle around the table. "Did you rearrange the chairs?" I asked my wife. She looked up from her coffee, confused. "Number, I thought you did." We both stared at the chairs, the tension in the room palpable. Later that day, we left for errands, hoping some fresh air would clear our nerves. When we returned, the unease hit us immediately. A stack of boxes we'd left in the hallway had been moved into the living room. A blanket that had been folded on the couch was now draped over the banister. "Are you playing a joke on me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Her face was pale. Why would I joke about this? That night, we decided to test a theory. Before going to bed, we deliberately placed a mug in the middle of the kitchen counter. The next morning, it was gone. We found it sitting neatly on the fireplace mantel, as if placed there with care. Over the next few days, the disturbances grew bolder. Doors we left open would be shut. Lights we turned off would flicker back on. And always, the faint sound of footsteps when the house should have been empty. One afternoon, we decided to leave and return quickly, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was doing this. We stood silently outside the door, listening for movement. After a few minutes, the distinct sound of furniture being dragged across the floor reached our ears. We burst inside, but the house was empty. The furniture was rearranged, a surreal mockery of our home's usual layout. A lamp was now on the kitchen counter, a pair of shoes sat on the coffee table, and an old family photo of ours had somehow made its way onto the bedroom dresser. That was the final straw. We packed our bags and left that night, leaving the rest of our belongings behind. Whoever, or whatever, was in that house clearly wanted it more than we did.